Good afternoon and welcome to Placecast, a local policy innovation partnership hub production based at the University of Birmingham. Placecast is essential listening for those keen to explore the ins and outs of knowledge mobilisation for influence in central and local government, based on the view that it's only through animating the power of place-based leadership that the wicked problems of 2025 can become more manageable. Whether you're a researcher, citizen scientist, an activist, a professional working within the public sector, a civil servant, politician, analyst, or entrepreneur, we think that it's through our networks that most solutions can be assembled, tested, and the learning shared before we go again. And that universities can act as repositories and observatories of these efforts. We're based at City-REDI and rooted in the LPIP programme funded by the ESRC and Innovate UK. This podcast aims to highlight knowledge and evidence base, ways of working, and the strategies needed to make a real impact on the decisions that shape our society. Our guests are change makers from across the UK, with stories about the ways in which influence can be achieved. We focus in particular on some of the connective tissue within and between sectors for clues as how to animate place-based leadership, as innovating is a team sport best done out in the open. Please contact us with feedback on the episode, or if you'd like to be a guest or have strong views on the processes of advocacy, lobbying, public campaigning, and more, unpacking how research and evidence connect with neighbourhood, local, city regional, and national missions. I'm Dr Nicola Headlam, a Fellow of the LPIP programme, with a long career at these intersections, and I'm offering a route through the projects and initiatives emerging from government. In particular, I'm most concerned about the ways in which the growth missions link with the devolution impetus, and further, the innovations emerging from Cabinet Office in their Test and Learn programme and the role of universities in this new world. My guests today are Professor Rebecca Riley and Dr Abigail Taylor, two really important parts of the LPIP hub, in that Rebecca is the Principal Investigator and Abigail leads on-place leadership for the LPIP. So, having looked at their very impressive CVs, they've both spent a lot of time in this space. Rebecca has worked for 20 years at the intersection between economic development and public service improvement, probably most notably in her work at the Northwest Regional Development Agency, which is probably about the time when we first came across each other, Professor. So, based on this famousness, you're probably most closely associated with sort of national attempts to have regional observatories that function. Can you tell me how you became engaged in that work?
I suppose I started my career wanting to actually follow an art background. I wanted to be a sculptor, and realised that actually I was more interested in making a change and sort of moulding the future rather than moulding a lump of rock. And I think that's when I took a career that was based on sort of sociology and the study of people within place, and also developing my skills across a broad range of methodologies in terms of how do you answer key challenging questions. And that became the basis of my career really. And then through that, I've worked, as you said, at a regional development agency where my job was around developing regional evidence bases for action, understanding how you might develop new interventions, and evaluating their impact. And then, following the closure of the RDAs, I went into the private sector where I was specifically looking at data and policymakers having access to academic research through a role where I manage sort of contracts and subscriptions to services.
And
Um,
that was the IDOC's
that
job.
was at iDocs, yeah, yeah. Which was fascinating in the sense of there is accessibility of research is a real barrier and a real problem, and I'm glad to see the differences that are happening around open access in that area. And I think that sort of now I was brought to University of Birmingham um, with the idea really of bringing those two parts of my previous roles together, both in terms of delivering and identifying policy impactful research with access to academic knowledge and expertise to be able to make new policy interventions, but at the West Midlands level. So the university had foresight really to invest in the development of City-REDI um, back in 2015, and I've been here since. And that the model that we adopted was very much about being responsive to government and UKRI funding calls that were place based, maximising the income that we could bring into the region to address regional challenges, and also, I suppose, fundamentally within that, building a hybrid team of academics and policy researchers so they could learn from one another, and develop a real sort of team structure in terms of how we deal with our local partners, how we help them manage change, and make a difference for Birmingham and the West Midlands.
And we do have a member of that team in our other speaker of the day, which is Dr. Abigail. Can you just tell us something about? I was very surprised when I was reading your CV to see that you're only 8 years postdoc, and you've spent quite a lot of that time in the LPIP and City-REDI universe, haven't you, Abigail?
Yes, thank you. Um, Lovely to be here today. So, yeah, I joined City-REDI in 2018. Originally, I was a policy and data analyst, and then I became a research fellow a couple of years after that. And I've really enjoyed my time as part of the team. When I first joined, one of the first things that I worked on was a piece in conjunction with the Smart Specialisation Hub that was looking, and I think it was where we first came across each other. Um, uh, which was looking at funding for local enterprise partnerships and governance structures. And funding and governance are both themes that have really played out through the different projects that I've worked on over the last few years at City-REDI. So after I finished that piece of work, I ended up actually being seconded into the Industrial Strategy Council, which at the time was run out of the Department for what was then the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And there I did some work picking up on that governance theme around the process of what local areas went through developing their local industrial strategies. And I also I should say, I originally did a French degree, and one of the things that I think has thread throughout all of my work is sort of understanding the role of place in social and economic inequalities. And we did some work there looking at what we can learn from international city regions in terms of levelling up. And then I've been back at City-REDI full time for a couple of years now, and continued that focus on funding and institutions in leading projects in conjunction with CIPFA, the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, and YFF, the Youth Futures Foundation. And so I'm really excited to be part of the hub and building on that collaborative nature of projects that I've worked on over the last few years.
So if I could just ask a supplementary about culture. So Beck alluded at the beginning to the building, the pre-investment in a way of the University of Birmingham in City-REDI, and then the Research England funding then came and the LPIP funding. Having been in and out of government and universities myself, what is it about building that kind of open culture within City-REDI that you've particularly enjoyed as an earlier career member of staff?
I think what I've really enjoyed is the opportunity to meet with a range of different policymakers from national, regional, local level, and understand the challenges and the opportunities that they have. Another early project that I worked on was when City-REDI led the Midlands Engine Economic Observatory, and I went round meetings of all of the different local enterprise partnerships in the Midlands, and it was fascinating to be able to be part of those discussions. So what I really
Mm.
value is that we're responding to um, very timely questions, but we're doing it as part of a big team, so you can benefit from the mixed methods, City-REDI and the LPIP more broadly benefit from people with a whole range of expertise across methods and disciplines.
Brilliant. And Beck, in terms of building the culture of City-REDI, that openness between open policy questions, but also quality research, I suppose your sort of strapline would be quality evidence-based for policy, wouldn't it?
The discussions before City-REDI was set up was between the mayor, the VC, the chair of the LEP, and the idea the idea was about how you could create a knowledge base in the region that would provide confidence in the knowledge and the decision making, so that government understood that local partners were using good evidence. So in that, the fact that it's academic
Mm.
quality levels is really important.
So this moved me beautifully. Well done. It's almost like you knew what I was trying to move you into. This section is called The Power of Place. So my question is, what is the potential for your work to reach maturity and become fully embedded? So you were just talking about using it for investment cases that were, to build cases to government around investment in the region. But more, what could change as a result, and what is the size of that prize as you see it?
I think the interesting thing for me is all of this is like one big experiment, isn't it, in terms of place-based working? And not that it hasn't already been done, that's the thing. And one of the features of the LPIP event that we had last November actually was this idea that a lot of the activity that is being encouraged now was done sort of as an add-on, and somebody used the phrase of being in the shadows, and I think we're now coming out of that phase, and actually with the various activities and changes, including the UKRI Place agenda, the letter from Bridget Phillipson about the role of universities in growth. All of these things start to shape the way universities, not so much how they behave, but how they are seen and how they are expected to play their role, which means that
Mm.
people doing place-based work are even more important than they have been in the past, and there's more opportunity to grow and develop that. And along the way is all this innovation and all this activity. And I think the role of the LPIP is to capture that and share it and build that network and work with other structures, like the University Policy Engagement Network and National Civic Impact Accelerator and UUK, etc., to think about how can we help people trying to do this, and corporately how are organisations doing this. And I think that will be the greatest impact that we could possibly have, is to create these communities of practice and knowledge base.
I think there's a quote from your colleague, Professor Goddard, where he says, universities have always been full of people that want to change the world, but they're going to have to do it in a less accidental way in the future. And I think that really sums up that, you know, as we know, we move in networks of people who've always been able to animate an evidence base in order to effect change. But then you're absolutely right. It's partly about that research being viewed as of use in a timely way and in the right format. I wonder, Abby, if it's not mean of me to ask, can you imagine what it might be like as an academic with this work being fully mature? Kind of what will you imagine that, you know, the university of the future, would it be very different to how it is now, or is it more of an incremental change, describing the kind of initiatives that Bex described?
I think we're trying to do both. In the short term, we are trying to respond to some of the most pressing questions. So one of the roles that I have in the hub is coordinating across the theme leads and across the new fellows like yourself who've just joined. So within the hub, we have about 15 work streams. 7 of these were given to us by ESRC, UKRI, so they relate to really important issues like skills, innovation, um, inclusive and sustainable local economic development, living and working sustainably, communities in their places, and cultural recovery. And then in addition, we've also put in place work streams around other strands of work which we think are often cross-cutting to achieving progress in relation to those themes. So professional standards, place leadership, data in place, funding and devolution, just to name a few of them. And each of the theme leads has put together a program of work for both over the short term, the next couple of months, the medium term to the end of this year, and longer term to the end of next year. And they involve a variety of activities from evidence reviews. We've already, as a hub, published 4 evidence reviews on innovation skills, local economy, and cultural recovery. And there's some more evidence reviews due out imminently. But we're also looking to produce policy briefings, responding to some of the areas of research interest that government has highlighted. And I don't know if Becky, you want to say more about this in a second, but respond to some of the questions that government has raised as key challenges right at the moment in the conversations you and other members of the leadership team have been having. But also, we want to create resources and signposts to existing resources that will last longer term as well and support more collaborative ways of working beyond the next couple of months into the future.
So it does strike me then that you're sort of describing the kind of warp and weft of some of the questions being much more policy maker driven, some being funder driven, some being researcher driven. And I guess that's the part that I find really exciting, is that if we ever get to a point where we're genuinely able to kind of co-produce, even, I believe as a social scientist, we don't have anything unless we're acting in a co-produced fashion. The development of a research question should never be done in isolation. It should always be in and amongst the kind of ferment of what is the art of the possible, what other kind of what's kind of in the ether about a topic, as well as refining your research questions kind of on your own. Thank you, that was very clear. My next section is Spotlight on Solutions. So I'd like you to think of something specific, please. It can be from anything that you've worked on, LPIP related or other projects, that has worked well in exactly this space. So either the development of institutions for, or the underpinning of funding for, this kind of evidence-based mobilisation that we're discussing. I'm going to go to Beck first. Her eyes are going up and right, which means that she's choosing something brilliant from her repository of career successes. Spotlight on solution, please, Professor.
I suppose that one of the things that I was involved in, and much like Abby in her stage of her career, was actually at the Regional Development Agency, and that was a combination of new, exciting organisation trying to tackle big challenges, and it was also there was security of funding over the longer term. There were clear guidance and outcome objectives set by government. There was local decision making around what that money was spent on, although at the time the partners didn't necessarily think like that. And there were great projects that I was involved in, either because I helped develop the research for them, or helped with the business case, or I went back and looked at the evaluation of them, that will still exist now. And I think that was where my network that I now haven't, that helps me with the LPIP, was formed. And unfortunately, a lot of those people were sort of dissipated with the various changes. And I think going out into the private sector, it was a very different structure, a different feel. And then coming back into this space, I think what struck me is all those good things and all that capacity and all that capability that was built up has been lost quite a bit. And we're now in a space where we're having to rebuild that. And that's the job of the LPIP, is to try and help that happen. and the the capacity, not just in local authorities, etc., but more generally in the whole environment, is diminished. I think one of the interesting effects of that, though, is the movement of people from those structures in the 2000s into universities, which I think has also helped universities be better prepared for the civic. So you see people like me through structures that bring that policy knowledge, that bring that in-depth research knowledge, and they can be real engines of change within universities. And you're seeing that in the LPIP network as well.
Without wishing to be overly obsequious, there aren't that many people just like you, Beck. I mean, there is people like Kirsten England out there that have had a similar, senior in local, senior in, and they're in and around the LPIP. I agree, though. I mean, the point is that the end of the regional tier, and we spent a lot of time scattered. But I agree with you. Most of my networks are 15, 20 years old, and it is the same people, and they're all in business schools now. They all eventually ended up back in business schools. That's kind of how the cookie has crumbled on that. So essentially, the solution that you would like to bring forward is a well-funded regional infrastructure.
I wouldn't. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to be regional. It needs to be at the right scale. And I do think that the government's approach is heading towards this. But I think you can't expect places to mobilise and make change and innovate if you're not investing in them and you're not giving them long-term security of funding. And sort of on one hand, it's good because we've been involved in a lot of projects, but actually, on the other hand, in terms of regional outcomes and national outcomes, it's not good, is the competitive nature of funding. And that's been a feature of a lot of work that Abby and I have been involved in, is it distracts um, resources away from delivery into constant churn and constant bidding, when in reality what you want at a place-based level is investment in long-term partnership and long-term activity. And this is the good thing about the LPIP and the pilots. I mean, I still think it's experimental, so we're seeing if it works, but at least it's a decent chunk of money and a decent chunk of time to grow these partnerships.
So just another word about scale then, because I guess place covers a multitude of sins. When we're not going to get a regional infrastructure that's sort of all singing, all dancing. I don't think that's certainly not my reading of the runes, but we do need something. The subnational is particularly denuded. This sort of goes back to Abby's research interest, really, in the sort of governance of the subnational, really. I always think of it as it's about marshalling scope at the scale that you can have impact, and not being overly doctrinaire about it's got to be neighbourhood or local authority or environment agency boundary or health boundary or whatever. You just need to sort of be much more adaptive than I think we used to be, which was a downside of the regional years. It felt like there was a stronger line, either side of which there was a lot more policy differentiation. But it's a good point. Long term, I get it, and I couldn't agree more in terms of the funding piece. Abby, a spotlight on a solution.
I think, as I mentioned, I've worked on a few different projects over the last few years where we've been trying to identify examples of effective collaborative partnership working across scales and partners. And one that particularly comes to mind is that last year we did a report in conjunction with SIPFA, which was looking at how different city regions and combined authority areas in the UK had invested in regional equality. And as when I did a case study for that report of South Yorkshire, and one example I found particularly interesting there was how a South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority had collaborated with various partners in the region effectively to successfully bid for an advanced manufacturing investment zone. And what I found particularly interesting about the example was how the partners coalesced around shared goals despite previous tensions. They built on existing sectoral strengths in manufacturing, and they also sought to spread the benefits of that intervention across the region. So the original idea was that it would be around the sort of core university assets located in Sheffield and Rotherham, but it was extended to Barnsley and Doncaster, and that helped address land development challenges, capitalising on how both Barnsley and Doncaster have quite a lot of land available for development, but it also enabled broader university assets to be brought in, so Health Innovation Campus on the Sheffield Olympic Legacy Park, Sheffield Hallam's Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre, for example. And to me, it really demonstrated the benefits of collaborative leadership and focusing on shared goals, sort of across local authority, combined authority, and university partners, rather than each institution taking a sort of narrow, institutionally driven perspective.
Excellent. And so, I mean, I have got an enormous. I think Oliver Coppard is doing an awful lot with the resource that he has to think in those kind of ways, which leads me with great cleverness to, if you'll excuse, où est-ce qu'on se trouve des histoires internationaux sur les communautés urbaines, par exemple, le contrat de ville en France? So this one's about international lessons that we can import or steal. And I was prompting Abigail to consider the community urbain model in France with the contrat de ville, which the main thing about those schemes is that they've had the same laws for, I mean, I think 40 years in the case of the community urbain, which is like our combined authority model. Sorry, you don't have to
Definitely.
answer in French.
No, I completely agree with you there. And it reminds me, I did my um, it was my master's dissertation comparing economic regeneration in Sheffield and Lille between 1970 and when was it 2010? Scary how time quickly has passed. But one of the things that will always stick with me is that in that dissertation, I did a table of key regeneration policies over the period in France and in the UK, and in the UK, my table was about 4 times longer because of the policy churn. And one of our colleagues on LPIP, as part of her evidence review on local economic performance, has just done a timeline of economic development policies to support and promote economic development and inclusive and sustainable local economic performance in England, and exactly the same thing comes out. You can really see that churn that Beck was talking about over the last few years. So if you haven't seen that, I really recommend reading Alice's evidence review, which is available on the Hub website.
I mean, it's mortifying dealing with cross-Europe. I mean, we obviously do it a bit less these days, but cross-European partnership working. I remember I did a project with the regional agencies in Paris, and at the time when ours was being dismantled, I mean, Beck, I think you remember, we were completely despondent about having any capacity at the regional level at all. And we're sitting in an amazing building that looked like the Pompidou Centre with floors and floors of people all arguing about which econometric model they were going to bring to bear. And we felt thoroughly depressed as that was a product of Almedal and Harding. I mean, and I think that's been again, the case that I know the best is Nice in the south of France, and the continuity of that community urbain model. It's most like the GMCA model in Manchester, but the resource. I mean, there's a brand new tram that they've dreamt up and delivered in shorter than the time that we've changed the name of the pot of funding more than 10 times. So yeah, I mean, I think the French comparison is brilliant. So, yeah, I didn't mean to tease you and make you answer in French. Beck, in terms of your perspective, can you think of a good international lesson to import or steal? I suppose, in a sense, the French example is back to robust institutions and the longer range and less policy churn. But have you come across anything? I mean, I think we do always talk about, don't we? Particularly the civil service has got quite a parochial mindset when it comes to it's not brilliant at doing the international piece. I mean, that's not, in the Sheffield example, Dan Turner's work with Ed Balls was brilliant in terms of pulling an international focus onto levelling up. But it's not always that the international lessons are well absorbed, particularly not in an era where it's seen as a kind of jolly culture if councillors or if, God forbid, regional leaders or mayors go on the sort of international circuit, it can be quite controversial in terms of what they're doing in terms of bringing in. I mean, I know that this has been a very live issue in Manchester about are these just jollies? But actually, things like MIPIM, things like those international, there's so much policy mobilisation. Did you have an international lesson?
So, I mean, this is one that I came across because of the LPIP, actually. Myself and Des, who's the chair of the LPIP board, were introduced by one of our delivery partners, Centre for Local Economic Strategies and Sarah Longlands, to
They sponsored my PhD.
small world, isn't it? That's the thing. We were introduced to the universities at Shady Grove, which is even the name's fascinating, but it was really good. And actually, Des went out and visited them, and we had some sessions with them because what was fascinating there is you've got an area of Maryland which is it's actually quite affluent to a great extent, and you're in the middle, you're in middle of seats of power, etc. But actually, this particular area had no university. It had very little opportunities, and there was a lot of very deprived communities. And the universities, the surrounding this, all have come together to set up a university campus, which is a shared campus offering different programs. I think akin to sort of foundational degrees to create pathways into sort of universities and innovation and broadening horizons really. And the model was brilliant. I mean, it's if you think of some of the issues that we have in this country and how university where you have places that have no university, what they might be able to do to create that. And I think what struck me with that as well is they'd done it in partnership with the Chamber of Commerce and the local areas, but really it was a university initiative to address a real problem. And I think part of that, and Des and Sarah in our team are doing a lot of work on international examples yet to be published. But part of that as well is about the different system in America, where your funding is linked to actually having local based outputs, and that might be about the land that you occupy and how it's been gifted. It might be the various endowments that people have, but there's a lot more sense of philanthropy and doing good, which this country doesn't particularly have in its funding structure. So I think they're sort of enabled to be much more innovative in the way that they work with their partners in that sense. And I think the American, particularly in the last few years, the funding that's gone into place, universities have been much more active and engaged in how that funding is spent and where it goes, which is one of the things that's sort of in the policy discussion now, isn't it, here in the UK, is how do we fund innovation? How do we fund sort of students and graduates? And how do we fund the commercialization of research? Is all hot topics. And I think we can look at other countries to see how that works.
And I mean, there is an awful lot of, I mean, I'm thinking about Robin Hambleton having brought the Carnegie Mellon model into the UK.
Mm,
It's quite well trod. The Boston Urban Dynamics,
mm,
absolutely fantastic, but slightly more tech oriented because of the MIT
mm,
connection. And there are, I mean, it's almost like twinning, isn't it? There's quite a lot of university to university
mm,
links of this
mm,
nature. But you're absolutely right about the idea about philanthropy. So I was just thinking when you were talking about an ancient project about Durham doing outreach into the Tees Valley years ago that Joe Painter was involved in. And then also, of course, we do have in Manchester an insurgent institution, which is the 92 University, and they are doing something completely different and breaking the mold. And I think that they could, it doesn't necessarily need to be the suite of institutions that are we recognise already. The 92 University is, I mean, it's very sort of online. And I watched a thing the other day where Gary Neville was giving 2 kids their tuition fees for free, and doing it in the house with their mum, and it's very different to kind of university outreach as we would see it from a Russell Group or an Oxbridge perspective. And so it's interesting. There's always the graft and grow potential for these kinds of things. They're really useful. Thank you. So just very simple question. What are you working on next? Presumably, I realise that you're both running this huge program, which is going to be taking up a lot of your time. But if you did have a kind of, curiosity based, if there was a trip you could do or a piece that you could do, what would your research agenda be in this space? What are you working on next? I'll go to Abby first.
Thank you. I will talk about what I'm doing on the two work streams that I'm leading as part of the hub. So, first one is place leadership, and it's really exciting that we have the first event coming up. So, on the 10th of April, we are organising a place leadership seminar or mini conference, you could call it, on the theme of capability and capacity building in place leadership. Identity, inclusion, and change. It's a bit of a mouthful, the title, but what we want to do is bring together people from the local partnerships, from across universities, and from across policy at various scales to share a collective knowledge or an understanding about place-based identities and how place leadership can build capacity and develop capability, um, to support opportunities for inclusive and sustainable growth, locally and regionally, and particularly how partnership working can address some of these challenges that we've just talked about in the climate that we've got at the UK in at the moment. And so we've got some great speakers already confirmed. Kirsten England will be reflecting on examples from across her various roles, and particularly her work as part of the Yorkshire LPIP, in relation to Bradford's City of Culture. We have Lucas Camera from the OECD, sharing some of the lessons from the transforming places work that they've been doing, that Beck's also been involved in, and Katie Trout, director of the West Midlands Growth Company, is going to be reflecting on how the West Midlands Growth Company used the Commonwealth Games to help develop capability and capacity in the region. And then quickly on communities in their places. So this stream is all about thinking about the role of communities in addressing place-based challenges, and some of the questions we're going to be thinking about as part of that, in conjunction with the partners across the hub, like Involve and the Young Foundation, are sort of, why is active community engagement important? How is it best conducted? When is it appropriate? When is it less appropriate? And just yesterday, we were discussing plans to organise a webinar to discuss some of these challenges and opportunities, and bring together learning from examples of where it's worked well and where it's been more challenging.
Brilliant. And I mean, I suppose it's a silly question, but you've now got your regional role as well in the university. So I don't think you're exactly thinking, brilliant, what shall I learn next? But what would be the magic project for you?
I'm alluding to that actually. So my time is split more or less 50-50 between the LPIP and the associated activities and projects, and the other 50% of the time I'm DPVC for regional engagement at the university. And I think in terms of, what am I working on next? Well, actually, I'm having to put, the money where my mouth is, sort of thing, in that I'm now having to take all this research and work about how we think should be done, and I'm actually trying to apply it within the university itself. And I think it's, so far I've been in the role since last September, but I think it's been an interesting sort of new type of role, because for quite a long time I've been doing the same thing but with different job titles, and this is completely different, I think, in terms of actually implementing some of this. And I think one of the challenges that we face, that although, all the stars are aligning in terms of, you know universities really are getting sort of turned on to doing civic really much in a much greater way than I've seen before. And to allude to your reference to John Goddard's quote, I think we are at that turning point now that universities do know that this is something good to do, and the next phase is, how do we do it? What do we do? How does that work? And I think, and that's the bit I'm sort of trying to do, and that includes upskilling people in universities, understanding region, understanding civic, understanding what place is, understanding the place they're in and the impact that they can have, setting some, sort of corporate goals around that and being more strategic about what we engage in. But that is all being done in the context that a lot of universities are sort of facing facing sort of funding issues and constraints, changes in sort of overseas students, etc. And the whole sector is under, a significant amount of turmoil. Luckily, I'm at Birmingham, and that's not facing those issues. But it does mean that you have to bear it. You have to think about how are we going to do this. And I think the thing for me is Abby and I did work on a project actually to win some funding, but we've not secured any yet. Was to look at international examples of how this is being done, both from the point of view of similar things to City-REDI, but also from the point of view of a more corporate approach and strategic approach to civic and place leadership and the role as an anchor institution. So that's the bit that I would like to build on. And interestingly, from the four LPIPs, one of the things that they would like to see the hub doing is thinking about this international question and what can we learn from, and how can we engage in that. But I think one of the other things in terms of my learning from the LPIP, you sort of always realise in the back of your mind that, that we are the UK, we have nations and we have regions, etc. And I think you don't quite understand until you're getting really deep into those relationships with those places trying to do this type of activity, how that relationship between Whitehall and place isn't working right, and that there isn't a good understanding between Whitehall and places. And I'm really looking forward to any impact or change that we can make as a LPIP network to improve that understanding of place in central government, so that they do understand what the devolved nations are, how they work, what that means, what that looks like, as well as regions.
I mean, I think it's possible to even go a bit further than that, Beck. I mean, I was at the Growth Flag launch the other day, and it became really clear that because of economic development being a devolved competency, I think it's being done a bit better, certainly in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. We all know the Barnett formula, that actually it's geared in the favour of the peripheral nations of the UK. But also, I just think in terms of, there is a really specific English problem
Yeah,
around the governance of economic development and growth and all of the, all those things. When I was at the House of Commons Library, I wrote a paper on the initial round of devolution, saying what are the learning mechanisms if the nations do things better than Whitehall. And it was sort of met with a lot of derision, like why would we need there aren't very, as you very well know, a policy process is sort of linear. You don't then have feedback on how did all that go and what can we do better next time. But in terms of the feedback loop of economic development in the subnational UK, there's loads of good practice that we can. I mean, Mark Hart and his colleagues at the ERC were talking about, do we need a body called Business England because it's so fractured at the English scale? I'm not sure that's the answer, but there is something about the different tiers of devolutions and the different powers. I think there is something, and I know I've heard Des speak on it, that he thinks that the Scottish scale, it's
yeah.
easier to get things done, and not just because of the circles that he's moved in, than we find in our big city regions and whatever.
That's one of the things I've noticed is, the the three LPIPs in the devolved nations have much closer relationships with their national government than Yorkshire has, and that we have in the West Midlands actually. And there's a clearer route, there's greater understanding, and I think, um, you know, I don't know whether that's a proximity issue or whatever. I don't know, but
Good old Peter John and
yeah,
his propinquity. It's not just about where you are, it's where you
yeah,
can
yeah, yeah,
get.
yeah.
And I think that's right. I think propinquity in governance is and in the devolved UK, we haven't we just let everything go. But the idea that, again, so Scottish Enterprise and all the rest of it, those are better partnerships, deeper partnerships than the policy soup that we've had with the churn from the LEPs and onward. So you're working next on scaling it deep and making it real. Very good. And you're working next as that RSA thing. I'm going to follow up with all the references. Everyone that we've mentioned, I'll be tracking down to ask the same questions as this too. So have no fear. So we're coming to the end now. So this is much more sort of specific questions, things that we've been discussing. Can you think of a specific person who's a really good knowledge broker? They can be an academic, they can be in industry. I'll come to you second, Beck, because I realise that you haven't seen this question. Abby, however, has had some time to think about it. So give me some brokers, because I'm going to be knocking on their doors for their views. But yeah, some people that you've worked with and you've really thought, yeah, they get it.
Well, I think on a daily basis, I'm incredibly lucky to get to work with Beck because she's such a good broker. But if we're thinking externally, two people who I think are important brokers in the Midlands are Wayne Langford. He's the director of West Midlands Combined Universities.
Yeah.
So that brings together, was it Birmingham City University, Coventry University, and the University of Wolverhampton. And Helen Turner, who is the director of Midlands Innovation, which are Aston, Birmingham, Cranfield, try and get this right. It would be bad if I missed someone out. Keele, Leicester, Nottingham, Loughborough, and Warwick. And I think that we've worked quite closely with both Wayne and Helen as part of WMEDI and various projects over the last few years. And what I've really valued are how, I guess, underpinned by a very strong understanding of the region that they work in. They are both great at working across boundaries to facilitate new collaborations. They're creative thinkers, and I think that they're particularly successful because they're both very approachable. And so you can have an idea, might not be that developed, but you won't feel worried about discussing it with them. And they're both very reactive as well.
Just reminded me of some really bad feedback I had on some work when I was quite young. I'm so glad that you felt you could share this with me in this state. I was a bit like, oh, that was the best I could do. So yeah, I know what you mean though. The developmental piece, you don't have to come with like all your bullet points. You can come and it can be quite. That's a really good. They're both really good shouts. Beck, who can you think of? And it be national or local.
I'm gonna go for a couple of people that have sort of I would say a similar drive to make a difference in their place and similar backgrounds, although they sort of not quite. They come from sort of a different background, and I'll explain that in a minute because of something that one of them said to me. I'm gonna. The first one is my co-director at City-REDI, so Anne Green. And Anne talks about me and her in the sense of we both stood in the same room, but we've come through different doors. So Anne has come from a traditional academic background, but always been engaged in impact. And she's been at the research institutes in universities that are all very engaged and active. And I think it's always a joy to work with her on projects, and her knowledge and expertise sort of is amazing, really, across a broad set of areas. As she says, she's an economic geographer, so she's interested in most things. The other one is similar, and more similar to me is Will Rossiter at Nottingham Trent. So Will and I have known each other for a very long time, in that we had similar roles. He was in the East Midlands, I was in the Northwest, and we had a great network of people doing these roles. And we've both ended up in a university doing the civic activity. So it's great. He's great as a sounding board. He's great to think through what the problems are. And also, we have a shared interest, and we both came through the same door into that room with Anne. What always, I think in terms of the brokers, it's the people that have a varied experience, background, and knowledge, and that they understand how the place you are works and how your partners work, and that's one of the reasons that I'm quite keen for anybody in the team to do secondments and placements like Abby has done, so she gets that knowledge and the others do. But that makes a really good knowledge broker.
Brilliant answer. Thank you. You could have both said me, but let's just leave it there. Can you think, in a similar vein, then, from slightly the other end of the telescope, can you describe a really good place leader? And I'll go to Abby again first, because this will be a surprise to Beck.
So the example when I saw this question that came to me first was Pierre Mauroy, who was mayor of Lille between 1973 and the start of the 2000s. And he was also at the same time for about 5 years, start of the 1980s, the Prime Minister of France. And when I did a report for the Industrial Strategy Council on the lessons that we can take from international city regions for how places can level up, because it was the time just after the levelling up white paper had been published. I interviewed various people who were academics, policymakers, in business representatives as well in Lille, and they all stressed how Mauroy was a great place leader because of his ability to be visionary and to be collaborative. So he helped raise Lille's profile enormously on the national stage and transform it into the international city today. So, for example, he was really key to ensuring that the Eurostar stopped in Lille, but also he was involved in well, at that time there was something called the Committee Grand Lille, which was a large network that brought together representatives from financial institutions, local businesses, Chamber of Commerce, civil servants, artists, politicians, etc. And that was really important in strengthening relationships across actors. And he also, everyone said, built consensuses across party lines. And one of the things, though, that really interests me is whether and how the role of place leaders is changing given the economic and the political challenges and opportunities we have at the moment. And so, as part of the place leadership work stream of the hub that we've talked about, I'm going to be working with Jamie Unan from Inner Circle Consulting, who's another member of the hub leadership team, and we're going to be investigating the sort of daily life of senior leaders to contextualize how they make decisions around the themes that the hub is focusing on, understanding how their role is changing. And then what we want to do at the end is try and map the process from crisis to recovery to thriving and draw out the leadership learning for partnership working at each of those points.
Brilliant answer. I mean, that's, again, a very specific French thing, that notion of the cumul mandat. So you are elected at completely different scales and you make it work. I mean, we all instinctively know that one of the things about being a good local leader is that you're able to operate at the United Nations scale down to the football field. It's the kind of, every level in between. But in France, they really exemplify that, because it's perfectly possible to have people at different sort of scales. Kind of, that's a really good example. Beck, can you think of a really good place leader?
I'm going to think of three, but they sort of come as a threesome. In that they when I first came to the West Midlands, and obviously with my economic development focus, the first thing I had to do was sort of make friends and get to understand the local enterprise partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
And the three sort of chief execs of the LEPs were all women.
Mm-hmm.
And they were also, and we know from the work that Abby did, three of the most successful LEPs in the country at attracting funding into the region and spending it wisely and having the processes in place. And the three women that led those organisations were Paula Diaz, Katie Trout, and Sarah Middleton. And they were absolutely brilliant people to work with, and still are, although Sarah's retired now and busy baking and knitting. And I think one of the things with that as well is they were all excellent partnership workers, and they brought together people to help deliver activities and projects. And as you said, particularly Katie representing Birmingham and Solihull, so at that international level. She was the chair. She was the LEP chair at one point, and galvanising great teams, great people to develop that sort of delivery. And for Paula and Katie, they're still in the structures within the West Midlands and still doing that. And I think it also demonstrates that good leaders can be in different organisations. They can be quite specific or they can be quite broad. But really, good leaders are made on the basis of people will follow and people will work with them and people will collaborate in the long term. And I think that's the skill sets that they brought to the region, and certainly, welcomed me into that network and helped me enormously, as Abby said, in terms of helping you develop your own networks, develop your own knowledge of how things work, and just really nice people to work with.
I mean, I think the good thing about having people like that on your side, it's not so much that they necessarily build it for you, but they can really help you to miss some of the obvious error. This is the background here. Don't foreground this. Focus on this. There's much more consensus here. That again, it's that weaving that
Yeah.
that place leadership's about. And you're absolutely right. The notion of distributed place leadership across more than one organisation, I think, is difficult for people that are used to hierarchies and silos.
Yeah.
Get their heads around that it can be distributed in that sense. Thank you. So you've got to the end of my long list, except just the last question. I have a moment of foolishness for you. I'm going to let you have a go on this, which is my place-based innovation magic wand. You've got to be very careful with it because it has powerful magic and it can grant you a wish. You will have absolute power to do one of these things, but you must use your powers to make a tangible change to a specific place. So your change will have to be specific, measurable, actionable, recordable, and transferable. Bex, just for you. Smart. Magic's very hard to get hold of at the moment and is subject to 20% reducing multi-year budget settlements, of course. So just to get you started, you can have a £10 million project fund, half an hour with the cabinet and a slide deck, editorial control of the front page of a tabloid, a clause to insert into a bill, a very simple message that goes viral on TikTok, anyone from any walk of life as an advocate for this work, or an answer to a question that has bothered you forever. So here you are. You've got a go on my magic wand. What do you think? So really, I've got in me brackets on my script. Hopefully, baffled laughter. What is the magic thing that can make this agenda really fly? Is it about? I mean, I certainly remember the work that George Clark did on housing, just for a moment, really ignited around an affordable housing kind of moment. And he was a celebrity and did a documentary, and it just kind of tilted that dial. Do you think it's in the social media scape? Is it in media? Is it in legislation? Like what do you want to do with my magic wand, Abby?
I think I'd pick up on this issue of capacity that we've talked about quite a lot. And one thing that I think could be really important, if it was possible, would be if you could create a sort of long-term £10 million fund a year in each combined authority area for funding split across combined authorities, local authorities, and universities um, to to improve monitoring and evaluation, because I think with all the capacity constraints at the moment, monitoring and evaluation is often squeezed. And if you could improve monitoring and evaluation, particularly the infrastructure to feedback learning into organisations, it'd help create stronger policy longer term.
Brilliant. So essentially, your ask is for a regional observatory structure, but with £10 million guaranteed.
Yeah,
I like it. Let's have that.
best to be ambitious.
Izzy Wizzy, what's the magic?
I'm doing some work with Birmingham City Council at the moment on their reshaping Birmingham. And a theme that comes up in a lot of our research is perceptions of Birmingham, including my own before I started working here. And what people say is, oh, it's quite nice here, I didn't know, or things like that. Oh, it's much better than I thought. I'm not quite sure what people thought. Birmingham was like, and Abby's from Birmingham, and I think if I could do anything, it would be picking up on one of the things that's emerging out of that Shaping Birmingham is this idea about what we can all do to improve Birmingham. What difference can we make? And it's forming into the shape of a promise. So what do I promise to do for Birmingham? And to an extent, that's what I'm doing with the university, is thinking about what do we promise to do as our contribution to make Birmingham better. And I think if I could do anything, you would have a sort of a viral TikTok thing, or social media, whatever, more broadly. I'm not particularly app allegianced, but if you could have some sort of viral thing that says, this is my place, this is my city, and I promise to make it better by doing this. And I think the more you have that confidence in where you live, a self-belief that you can make a difference, the better. And I think it's what people need now, because we're in very turbulent times, and globally there's obviously the issues that we're facing. And I think the more that we can make people think about the place that they live, shout about it, be bold. There's the Be Bold Birmingham sort of activity that we've had, but be more engaged about making sure that people know how great places are. Then that message, if that gets back to central government, if it gets back to cabinet office, if the decision makers have more of a sense of these places are great places and we should be investing in them, wouldn't that be a great world to be in?
I tell you, who's definitely done the most for that, I think, is Stephen Knight with his regional
Exactly.
film studio. That at the same time as you can't get stuff built on the green belt around London
Yeah.
to extend Pinewood, the work that he's done in the canals of having a kind of one-stop shop studio, that's exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, isn't
It
it? Is
is.
that
Yeah,
regional
yeah,
patriotism?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Amazing.
yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, I should say at the end that just in case, we are researchers. Of course, I don't believe in magic wands, but one thing I do believe in is magicians, and you have both given lots of examples of a magician-based approach to doing this work together. I've thoroughly enjoyed this hour. So just to close, I would just like to thank anybody who's made it through this whole hour for joining us. We set out to mine insights from experts, real-world case studies, practical tips and career advice, and to spotlight solutions as well as wave the place-based innovation magic wand. And we have. Thank you.